Now, auto surgery.
Autosurgery, well, that was done many years ago, of course. It was actually done during a mountain climbing accident by Astophiles. Astophiles was big on climbing mountains. So he was climbing a mountain, he fell, and he hit a stick that was sticking out, and he fell down on a ledge. But as he passed that stick, it kind of made an incision across his belly.
Wasn't that the first appendectomy?
Yeah, and he felt a lot better. Now, he brought that appendix down with him, down the mountainside. This is the thing. He actually sewed his cut together with some twine from his toga.
Now, there were some other organs that other famous Greek removed.
There was the famous warrior Stanislav.
Did he remove an organ?
Well, he would remove an organ, and if the guy still lived, he'd say, well, I guess he doesn't need that.
What about the brain? Did he try removing any brains? Nowadays, we know that when you remove someone's brain, they don't survive that.
You lose your personality, and you're no longer fun at parties, and
wasn't there a guy called Bagel-Glass?
He was obsessed with pancreases. He discovered that if you took out your pancreas, you didn't survive.
What does your pancreas do?
Bagel-Glass never really did know what the pancreas was, and I've only studied Bagel-Glass's notes. He used to say that having a pancreas removed would make you more financially successful. He was banished to the hinterlands. Some tribes eventually killed him because he said that if you didn't have a pancreas, you would get more cows, because cows were the currency out there with these tribes.
Wasn't there another guy who tried to improve sight? He said if you want to see things better, you should get closer to them.
His father was a mathematician, and he named his son 2020. And that was the big conclusion. People would come and say, I can't see very good, and his prescription would be, go closer. So they would go closer, and it would in fact work. And they thought he was a genius.
And they named a city after him, didn't they? Myopia, and they made everything bigger so people could see it.
The words go all the way back to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. They found these cave drawings, and it looks like there's a Neanderthal throwing a Homo sapien. But they picture it, they show presenting one Neanderthal to another a necklace.
So there's no sphincters involved?
I don't think Neanderthals knew that they had a sphincter. They weren't that medically advanced.
You could never see your own sphincter unless you had a mirror.
You'd have to go get in a highly reflective pond of water.
Whereas the Greeks had mirrors, so they were able to see their own sphincters.
The Greeks were always on top of those sort of things.
I heard that the study of sphincters made its way to the ancient Egyptians.
Egyptians adopted this from ancient clay tablets that they found in Mesopotamia. And then they thought, Sphinx, that makes sense. And so they put a person's head on the body of a lion, because that's pretty much what they did when they couldn't understand something. They said, it must mean an animal with a human head. And the pyramids, people, little do they know that those are big monuments to the art and science of proctology. It was seen as a guide to good health, was to sit on a point for a while. If you could do that, you would strengthen your sphincter muscles. And it was also a competition. It'd be an award for who could sit on a little pointy pyramid with their bare ass the longest.
One of the pharaohs, the pharaoh Bum Bum,
he was found wandering in the desert, trying to avoid anything that had any kind of point on it because he was traumatized. And he got into furniture design, and he invented the first toilet. He got an award for that.
It was the Kaibo Award.
Also, the Camel Face Award. They thought camels had handsome faces, and it was a compliment.
And sphincters.
Yeah, camel faces and sphincters were pretty much on par with each other.
You know quite a bit about advertising, I hear.
Oh, yes. Well, I had to sell my old Volare. Why don't I target a specific part of the population like cat lovers? I put a whole bunch of cats in the car. They put their aroma in there and included a free cat. And as soon as the person sat in the car, it was this 80-year-old woman. She sat in the car and she said, I love the smell of a new car. And I said, it's not a new car. She said, but I don't care. I love the smell. Well, of course, it was the smell of cats.
And you gave her one cat?
Well, she already had 50 cats. She had this big farm in the country, so one more cat didn't really matter. I mean, she had a big barn and everything, and I delivered her out there because she didn't have a driver's license. And so then I drove it out there and parked it, and she thanked me profusely. She was just turning it into a big cat house, a big plaything for the cats. And she had quite a few other old vehicles there. She always kept the car from the late husband.
She had more than one late husband?
She'd gone through like about 10 of them. And then I said, wow, that's really something. She said, yes, every time one of my husbands died, I got 10 more cats. That's when she started collecting cats. She said, well, I got to have some companions and I love cats and I inherited the farm. So she got 10 cats.
So every husband was 10 cats.
Yeah, every time the husband died, she kept the old car.
You said she had 10 husbands and 50 cats. At 10 cats per husband, that would be 100.
Okay, well, then I sit corrected. Well, then she had 100 cats.
Cats die after a while. So of those 100 cats, some of them would have died by now.
Oh, yeah, they're kind of procreating.
Oh, they're procreating as well. So there really should be no connection between a number of husbands and number of cats.
Oh, yeah, but it's the official 10 first cats. Each cat had a collar that had a little picture of that particular husband on their collar. Those were the cats that pertained to that dead husband. When the cats did die, she would hang up the collars on little hooks in the barn. And so then there was the retired collars of each husband. Kind of creepy, really. But, all those 10 cars parked out there, and each one had a cardboard cutout of the husband sitting in the passenger seat.
The husband would have been the driver.
Sitting in the passenger seat represented that he had died. People would come and say, I can't see very good, and his prescription would be, go closer. So they would go closer, and it would in fact work. And they thought he was a genius.
And they named a city after him, didn't they? Myopia, and they made everything bigger so people could see it.
In fact, many people who suffered from short-sightedness would go to myopia, and all the signs on the shop were really big letters, and everyone who had short-sightedness and problems seeing, they could see everything better there because all the buildings were bigger, all the letters were bigger, everything was bigger, so you could see it better from a distance.
And there was the other city, which I forget what it was called, but it was people who were farsighted would go there. Everything was small.
That wasn't too successful, though, because for some reason the architects made doorways too small and no one could go into the shops and people went bankrupt.
Who was the guy that discovered that? That was 2040, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, that was 2020's second cousin. That is quite funny. When that family would get together, there was 2020 and 2040, and there was Pi. Also, life of the party, 4 divided by 2. The people liked him.
2 for short, didn't they?
Call him 2 for short. If they were in a hurry.
I had a really close friend, 22/7.
They were the best of friends. You could always know that who's having a good time, it would be Pi and 22/7.
They only disagreed a very small amount.
It calculated that it disagreed only 0.1% of the time. That was impressive. It was funny because they also had a friend who was called 0.1.
He'd be Pi minus 22/7?
Well, Pi and 22/7 were friends, and they also had an occasional sidekick called 0.1.
I think he was called 0.0013.
Well, but that's his full name. So they would just call him 0.1, just like...
just between friends.
Between friends. You're my friends, just call me 0.1. And everyone else had to call him, hey, 0.0013. His mother would always call him, 0.0013, what the hell are you doing? Oh, yeah, you knew she was mad.
His mom was the square root of 2, wasn't she?
Her name was square root of 2. The whole town were mathematicians, of course. And one time there was a family picnic, and 22/7 and Pi and 0.0013 and the square root of 4. What's the mother's name again?
Square root of 2.
Oh, yeah, square root of 2. And his dad, 10 to the power of 3.
Yeah, but he had a good friend called 1,000, didn't he?
I had a good friend called 1,000. And they would get together sometimes, and their names would actually make mathematical formulas. They once discovered the fermentation rate of peach wine. And once they had that calculation, they're one of the first ones who created peach wine and became quite famous for it. They would have rousing celebrations and all get quite drunk because they discovered one of the first fermentation.
It was 0.08, wasn't it? Isn't he the first guy that discovered the inebriation was 0.08?
That's who it's named after. It's 0.08. For short, he was just called Point.
Didn't he have a brother called Decimal 08?
Yeah, Decimal 08. Well, that was confusing, though, on their birth certificate.
And then wasn't there another guy called 1,234?
Oh, 1,234. He invented the label for the wine bottles. No one put labels on anything. It didn't make much sense, though, because he only invented the label. He didn't invent printing on the label. It was blank.
Well, he also didn't invent the sticky side of the label. So he was putting labels on things, they were just falling off.
Yeah, he was quite humiliated by that. I think he became despondent and became a monk in a cave. And then he became considered a holy man. He didn't really know anything, but because he lived in a cave, they thought, well, if you've got a problem, go talk to 1,234. He lives in a cave. He's all despondent because his labels never stuck on things.
Yeah, but when someone invented adhesives, that ruined his cave lore. People no longer went to him.
Well, he was humiliated because who invented adhesive? Wasn't that the square root of 60? Yeah, the adhesive, he made that out of his mother's jam. And, because it was inedible. His mother was a very bad jam maker, apparently. And so the square root of 6, he felt sorry. Instead of eating it, he wiped it on a clay wine jar. And then to hide that, he stuck a piece of scrap paper on it. And that thing would never come off again. But still, there was nothing on the label. Now there was just jugs with these blank labels on there. Then there was the person who invented the ink. His name was E equals MC squared. It didn't mean what Einstein meant. This is just a complete coincidence that his name was E equals MC squared. It meant different things.
E stands for eat.
Eat equals meat, carrots, twice the usual amount. It was just a short definition of what to eat. Came up with one of the first diet plans. You'd have the peach wine, you'd get it, and then what are you going to eat? Well, it would be eat equals meat with twice the carrots. His parents were so convinced that their newborn son should follow this diet, they named him E equals MC squared, so he'd never forget what they wanted him to eat. As a teenager, he traveled over to Myopia. In the passenger seat.
The husband would have been the driver.
Sitting in the passenger seat represented that he had died.
How did she get to the place where you sold the car?
Oh, well, I think she just hitchhiked. Apparently she had quite the story, though. There was some trucker who picked her up, and he was some sort of psycho. He was going to take her out to the woods and murder her.
But what happened?
Well, she said, then I took out my second husband's switchblade and stabbed him in the thigh. She had an affinity for marrying Navy SEALs. You expect an 80-year-old woman to show up in a nice little floral dress. No, she was dressed out in full military garb. She was wearing a bulletproof vest.
That was 10 trips she had to make to buy cars.
The husbands bought the cars previously. When she had a husband, the husband would go buy the car. It was his car. He would do the driving. And then when he died, she got 10 cats in memorial.
The last husband didn't buy a car, so she had to buy it.
Well, I got to tell you, this is kind of embarrassing. Her whole plan was to buy a car and get a new husband. She started getting kind of frisky with me when I delivered the car. Well, she said, I can bake a hell of a lemon meringue pie. Would you like to come in the house and live?
And you said?
I gotta go home and pay my water bill. And she fell for it.
Well, how'd you get home?
I had to run.
You didn't hitchhike?
No, I was kind of freaked out by the whole trucker debacle. I didn't want that happening to me. I didn't have a Kevlar vest and all this Navy SEAL training.
So she's still out there today, roaming the city for potential husbands.
She erected a big billboard with flashing lights. It says, wanted husband. I make a hell of a lemon meringue pie. Come in and live with me. And must love cats.
I heard that there was a cat population counter on that side.
She's in the World Book of Guinness. She herds cats. I've seen her. She's out there like some shepherd with a big staff and all these cats running around in front of her. It's a good thing she believed my thing about the water bill, because she would have probably just given the signals and these cats would have come out of the barn and blocked my path out of her driveway. Yeah, God knows how she got those previous husbands. Maybe they didn't even want to be there. Has been some investigating journalism going on, and they can't find any wedding licenses.
What about bodies?
Come to think of it, I did see a little cemetery out the back. She said, oh, that's the cat cemetery. I didn't want to look too closely, but I said, well, that happens to be 10 tombstones out there. And she says, I can't give a grave for each cat. There's too many cats. So I just wait until there's 20 cats, and then I create one funeral ceremony. Also, the camel face ward, they thought camels had handsome faces, and it was a compliment.
And sphincters.
Yeah, camel faces and sphincters were pretty much on par with each other.
Now, what about Hippocrates?
He was one of the guys always on the sidelines, trying to figure out a way how he could make his little statement in the history.
Now, I heard that he was so despondent, and he left that field, and he became a zookeeper. And that's where he got the name Hippo.
Hippo.
Didn't he make containers for hippopotamuses? Hippo crates.
He made crates for hippos, but he said that he was a zookeeper, but this wasn't really zookeeping. This was just keeping animals in crates, and so a hippo crate became associated with someone who says one thing but does another. Yeah, and he got an award for inventing something that people found annoying.
What was the name of the award?
Oh, it was the grand sphincter.
Sphincter is just a circular muscle. The most commonly known sphincter is your anus. He became associated with proctology because of that.
Figured, well, if they're going to call me the grand sphincter, then I should take advantage of it. And he said, well, I got an award for it, so I'm an expert at it. And if you're having any problems, I just know everything there is to know about them.
Well, people would come to him for advice, and they'd say, I'd like to know a little more about sphincters.
He would have people pose for him, and he would draw their sphincters, and then he would have contests to see if people of the towns could guess their own sphincter.
It's like baby photos. You work in an office, everybody brings in their baby photos, you mix them up, and you try to match them up.
That was was a big festivity. People got quite excited and came from all around just to participate in the great sphincter guessing game. And there'd be a award, of course. The person who did win and guessed the right sphincter would often be stuck in a big ball of dough and rolled down the hill, which was considered the highest of compliments because they were using a big ball of dough just for amusement's sake.
Like the Greeks, this is not well known, they're famous for their busts of various Greeks. But they also made busts, well, I guess it wouldn't be called busts, but they also made models of famous Greek sphincters.
There was the great sphincter temple where people would go and worship the sphincter god because they said, hey, if your sphincter's not in agreement with the rest of the things, you can forget about having a happy day.
His parents were so convinced that their newborn son should follow this diet, they named him E=mc², so he'd never forget what they wanted him to eat. As a teenager, he traveled over to Myopia. In fact, many people who suffered from short-sightedness would go to Myopia, and all the signs on the shop were really big letters, and everyone who had short-sightedness and problems seeing, they could see everything better there because all the buildings were bigger, all the letters were bigger, everything was bigger so you could see it better from a distance.
And there was the other city, Hyperopia.
That wasn't too successful, though, because for some reason the architects made doorways too small and no one could go into the shops and people went bankrupt.
If you go to Myopia today, it's basically a ghost town.
There's nothing but a few empty cars laying in a dusty street.
And big letters.
Oh, yes, of course, big letters. They were one of the first inventors of the billboard. They would put up something like a shop that was selling shoes, and there would be a huge billboard above the store with these huge fonts saying shoes. And that was one of the first billboards, but it was just big letters, so people who were short-sighted, they could see it.
Because the letters were so big, they couldn't put too many letters.
You could only sell something that was described by a short word. It's one of the drawbacks to their billboard technology. Well, then there was the potatoes. The potato, he would just put poo. People didn't understand. People would come all the way, and they, people looking for manure and stuff for their fertilizer. And then he'd say, "No, I don't have fertilizer. I have potatoes." And they said, "What do you got poo up there for?" "Well, potatoes has too many letters. It wouldn't fit on the billboard."
Well, they were explorers, weren't they?
Yeah, there's nothing funnier than a whole group of short-sighted explorers. They could never see where they're going. And they also thought that after a short distance, they had traveled a very long distance. They'd set up gear. They'd set off from the town. They're going to go and discover a new land. And then, the next morning, they're camped like just a short distance away.
Because they couldn't see where they started.
Exactly. They couldn't see the town anymore. They said, well, let's keep going until we can't see the town. So they would keep walking, and they only get a short distance, and they would camp. And the people who were in the town, they couldn't see them either. Thought they were gone for a long time. And then, of course, they'd travel the next day, and they'd be a little further away, and the next day a little further away. But most of the time, they never returned because they could never find their way back.
What about the Hyperion? Say, well, let's walk until we can't see the town. But they could see it no matter how far they were. They gave up.
Yeah, they did. They got tired. They walked and walked, and they said, we can still see the town. How far are we going to go? Well, let's go back. They weren't very diligent explorers. They didn't discover too much.
That's why they didn't have an empire like the Myopian.
Yeah, the Myopians, they just kept going, and then they had to settle somewhere because they could never find their way back. And some of them, they grew up and made a whole new town and civilization like only 4 miles away from where they started. They thought they were in another country. I mean, they couldn't see any landmarks. There was a big mountain range right nearby. They couldn't see it. So they didn't have any landmarks to familiarize themselves with. Everything looked unfamiliar.
Everything would look blurry.
Well, it's too bad that the Myopians and the far-sighted Hyperopians, they didn't get along. And if they would have collaborated in the numeral town, everybody cooperated. But it's a story about cooperation. People who could see the others were offended because the others wouldn't respond when they waved hi. They're waving hi, saying, how you doing? And the Myopians, they wouldn't wave back because they couldn't see them.
Right.
They got offended. They thought they were being rude and they being ignored. So they never got along.
They started to avoid them.
Yeah. Now, if they would have gotten along, maybe they would have accomplished something.
Right next door to the numeral town, there was the variable town, wasn't there?
Yes, and they would get together, and that's when calculus was invented. Polydamas, he was visiting from Greece, and he would just record what they say, and he came up with these calculus formulations.
A lot of people think it was Newton and Leibniz, but really it was polygamist.
He was just very popular, and he would get married, and then he'd get married again.
He had short-term memory, so he would forget that he was married.
He'd just marry someone else. And he was popular and quite funny in the moment. Unfortunately, he didn't remember the happy times together.